Welcome to Puro Politics, the political podcast of the San Antonio Express-News. My name is Gilbert Garcia, Metro columnist, and I'm joined by
City Hall reporter Joshua Fechter,
investigative reporter Brian Chasnoff.
And it's been a week since we got together with you all, and what have we learned in that time? We've learned that if you're having breakfast with Patrick Von Dolen, you might not want to order fresh squeezed grapefruit juice, particularly if he's picking up the tab. Just wanted to put that out there. But we also learned over the past week a lot more about how the city voted in this recent election. And Josh, you, Emily Eaton, and Ryan Serpico did a really excellent piece taking data from the Bexar County Elections Office and kind of breaking it down and looking at how the city voted. What were the big takeaways for you when you looked at that stuff?
When I took a look at it, a couple things struck me. One was, Prop B, as you could probably glean from the result, was fairly divisive. Like there were a lot of parts of town where it was very sort of neck and neck. But it was mainly sort of like conservative Northsiders that sort of drove the opposition to it. Everything, all of the support that you could see for it was, sort of coming from within the inner city, but obviously votes either or for or against were coming from all over the city, but those were where it was most concentrated. And, what struck me about this was at the same time that this was going on, Mayor Ron Nirenberg was basically making inroads all over the city. There's pretty much no part of San Antonio where he didn't do better than he did in 2019 and 2017. He basically took over a lot of, typically sort of conservative territory on the north side, right. A lot of territory outside of 410 that typically votes Republican or conservative. Areas that went for Trump in November wind up going for Nirenberg this time. Places that voted against him in 2019 went for him this time. It's kind of a sign that he's of either one of two things. Either he's really broadened his support during the pandemic, or he's just figured out ways to sort of turn out his voters and to get sort of these, sort of left-leaning votes that will come out in favor of him. Yeah. And he's managed to do that all across the city.
Well, I'm curious what everyone's take is on this, because one of the things I remembered, we've talked a little bit about Julian Castro when he ran for his third term, and he got reelected easily. I think he got about 65%. But the turnout was very low. And I remember that at the time there was kind of this feeling like it was kind of an underwhelming result for him, given that he didn't have any strong challengers. And, because this came right after, a few months after pre-K 4SA had passed, which was a divisive issue. It was a few months after he had spoken at the Democratic National Convention, which kind of put him out there a little bit more as a partisan figure. And so you could kind of sense that the support for him, it was starting to become more something along partisan lines. Whereas with Nirenberg, it seems like he's becoming more of this bipartisan figure in San Antonio. I mean, is that the way you all, when you look at the results, is that the big takeaway?
I mean, yeah, I think, especially after, he defeated Ivy Taylor, there was a feeling that, he was a clear-cut progressive and the city council was about to take, a hard turn to the left. I think he's, kind of conducted himself in a much more nonpartisan way. I think, conservatives might disagree with that, looking at things like, winning support for a sales tax for job training. But yeah, I mean, I think he's, he, at least in tone, he's been very careful about portraying himself in kind of a nonpartisan way. And I think that has its appeal, coupled with the fact that it's like, look, the last year has been like completely unique in the history of San Antonio. I mean, we've never before had a pandemic shut down the city. And, he managed that very well, and I think he got credit for it. So you couple, his performance, the way he handled himself during the pandemic, and his kind of, nonpartisan bent. I think that, that goes a long way in explaining the election result.
What do you think, Brian?
Well, I don't think he actually had a formidable challenger.
Right.
I mean, I just don't think Brockhouse really delivered on whatever potential he had left.
Yeah.
That might be a result of. I don't know what y'all's opinion is on this, but he might have been just too badly damaged the last time around.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think that in a way we would have a better test if he'd had maybe an opponent who was really able to sort of galvanize conservatives in a way that Brockhouse this time around at least was not really able to do. And it was really fascinating looking at that map because, as you pointed out, Josh, I mean, if you look around like the perimeter of the city, that's really where the opposition to the Prop B was. But in those same areas, you see so many precincts where Nirenberg that he was able to flip from 2019. One thing that I also thought was interesting is that, in talking to people who were really involved with labor, and this is where Prop B got complicated because you had a lot of sort of progressive Democrats who voted against Prop B because they have a history with organized labor. And I was told that like AFL-CIO really worked hard in District 9, which is, North Side district. And they got, what I heard was something like 37% turnout among people who were either active or retired AFL-CIO. And I would think a lot of those people were against Prop B. So this is, if you look at these kinds of things, I mean, that could have made the difference in this kind of a close election.
Yeah, it shows you definitely the split that Prop B kind of created among sort of left-leaning voters. I mean, you have obviously probably more old school labor Democrats who were, kind of skeptical about Prop B, and sort of these sort of more hardline progressive types, or just more strident. Sort of police reform types who really were like, what, we need to see some kind of reform. I mean, in District 1, for example, this passed by more than a margin of Prop B, passed by more than a margin of 2/3. And so I think it did really create a split. One other thing that was interesting to me about this is, Nirenberg making inroads in some of these other, more conservative parts of town. He deliberately sort of went after places that went for Biden on the North Side and places that went for the Ready to Work program in November, which we have to remember passed by 76%, and you don't get there without some degree of conservative Republican support. So, I mean, they were definitely going out and trying to flip a lot of Brockhouse territory that kind of signaled that perhaps it was more amenable to the mayor this time around.
I was going to say, I also wonder how demoralizing it was for Republicans, the entire Trump fiasco from November through January, February. I've heard. I just don't know if that might have taken the wind out of Brockhouse's sails somewhat, because I'm sure the election, the false election narrative that Trump had pushed, and culminating in the insurrection in January, it might have just turned a lot of people off, who otherwise would have been.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, I do get the feeling though that Trump supporters who, on January 5th believed that Democrats had stolen the election from Trump, I think on January 7th, the day after, they still felt that way. I mean, I don't know that would dissuade them from voting in the city election.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's 70% of Republicans supposedly still believe that Biden stole the election. So
I think what it could have done is that it may have affected how much Brockhouse wanted to tie himself to Trump, or the way he tried to message his Trump supporters. Because from what I saw, I mean, Brockhouse, his campaign messaging this time around was clearly different. Like he was, even while he opposed Proposition B, he talked about how he wanted to get together with police, reform groups and talk to them. And in almost every case, he talked about, wanting to listen to the other side and talk. And he was not, at least from what I saw, he was not as strident as he had been 2 years before. And, that the strident message would probably help to, attract hardcore conservatives 2 years ago. But maybe
to me that was always a defining attribute of Brockhouse, how he kind of straddled issues. Have you noticed that? How
yes.
he would rail against something and then vote for it.
Yeah.
When he was on council, it was sort of a perplexing characteristic.
It's absolutely. Yeah. He was like, I'll vote for it, but I'm not happy about it. Or I voted against it just because I didn't like the process by which it was, he would, you're right.
Yeah.
I mean, he has had a history of that, of sort of wanting
and then Nirenberg was like, process? You want some process?
Yeah, that's right.
The king of process.
The king of process. Josh, you had a really good story this past week, which I think was an eye-opener for a lot of us about the spending on the campaign, because, up until you wrote about this, I think we all thought that the San Antonio Police Officers Association hadn't really spent all that much on the campaign, that they had been outspent by a large margin compared to Fix SAPD. And it looks like they were kind of... well, I don't know if we would say they were hiding their funding and their spending, but tell us a little bit about what you found.
Well, it was certainly not easy to find if they weren't deliberately hiding it. So basically, it's like you said, Gilbert. Like throughout this whole campaign, like everybody was sort of scratching their heads. The police union appeared to be sort of like spending very little to fend off like this. I mean, it was an existential threat to their collective bargaining rights. And, throughout the campaign, they only seemed to be spending about 5 figures throughout the whole campaign. And, people had been who were sort of union allies were like, what are they doing? Like, why aren't they running like a really robust campaign? Well, it turns out they were spending quite a bit. And we should note that, Fix SAPD was raising and spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, a lot of it coming from the Texas Organizing Project, 6-figure donations from top and, various sort of top affiliates. And, so everybody was wondering, well, where is the police union on this? And it turns out that they were spending quite a bit. They were spending north of $600,000. But the reason nobody seemed to know about this was that they weren't filing it underneath their own name. They were not filing it under the San Antonio Police Officers Association. They weren't filing it under their PAC. Instead, they were filing it under the name of the union's treasurer. And this was, credit where credit is due. Fix SAPD discovered this, and which is how I found out about it. But I talked to people who have sort of experience dealing with the State Ethics Commission, people who are experts in campaign finance law, and this seems like a big no-no. If you spend money, you have to disclose it under your own name. So there's a potential that, they could face a fairly hefty ethics commission fine. But that's kind of contingent on whether anybody actually wants to file a formal complaint about this. Fix SAPD hasn't said whether they're going to go that route. But yeah, so it gives a whole lot more. Like if you thought that it was weird that the police union didn't appear to be spending that much, and yet you saw a lot of block walkers from them, you saw a lot of signs, you saw them, manning the poll sites in a fairly sort of hefty presence, this would go a long way towards explaining that. And we should note real quick that the $600K they spent all went to this basically this local PR shop, Public Alliance.
It's like a big block expenditure, so you can't really see much of the there's no real line item sort of.
Do you have any sense of why they would hide their spending like that? Why would they try to mask it?
What their explanation for all this was simply, well, the Texas Ethics Commission didn't give us the option to file it under our name. So, it would only allow us to file it under our treasurer's name, if you look, you can look up anybody's spending. You could look up the San Antonio Professional Firefighters Association spending fairly easily. So, I mean, I'm not sure about that explanation of theirs. But basically, if you just kind of think about this as a different kind of, basically the money was coming straight out of union dues. It wasn't coming from campaign contributions as far as I can tell.
Right.
It was coming out of sort of direct sort of contributions to the union from its members. And basically you're allowed to do sort of direct campaign expenditures on a ballot measure. And you can basically spend as much as you would like on it. Corporations and unions are allowed to do this, but you have to report it under your name. Otherwise, that's sort of flouting the law and the spirit of the law.
One of the things that I was thinking about, because, is that in doing it this way, I mean, one of the big issues for SAPOA in this election that they kept driving home was this idea that Fix SAPD was getting tons of outside money, as you said, from Texas Organizing Project. And they were kind of making a big deal about that. And that's often a big, campaign message that where one side will say, all this outside money's coming in and this is weird. And so I think SAPOA possibly looked at this situation and thought, it was going to be a much more effective argument. I'll put it this way, for SAPOA to be able to say that if people didn't see how much money they had in their coffers and how much they were spending. I mean, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely sort of weakens their whole stance on this measure. I mean, they were arguing this whole time that, Fix SAPD was just getting, a bunch of dark money, which they were, but they were also hiding, to some degree, whether they meant to or not, where their spending was, and by virtue of the fact that they're a union, they do not have to disclose where that money comes from. They say that it's from their union dues and that it's out of their sort of their general budget, but they don't have to disclose that to the public or the IRS. So, it definitely, splashes back on them to some degree. Yeah.
Before we wrap things up, I wanted to talk with you, Greg, a little bit about a column you did this past week. Former mayor, former HUD secretary, Henry Cisneros is the lead author on a book sort of looking at the Texas economy and where we're going, and it's focused on the Texas Triangle, which includes Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, the San Antonio, Austin area. What were the big points that he and his co-authors were trying to make about the Texas Triangle?
That if you take those three urban centers together, their impact is huge. I mean, really, that's the thrust of it. I mean, it's got just the Texas Triangle. It's got a GDP, a gross domestic product of about 1.3 trillion annually. That's just over the last couple of years, and that makes it, I think, the fifth largest of the world's leading mega regions. The trick is, the book, the Cisneros' book is all about defining, these three urban centers as the Texas Triangle. And, he provides just a wealth of, data and a lot of detail, kind of making the case that this is a huge economic engine, not just for Texas, obviously, but for the country. It's catching up with Northern and Southern California. It's catching up with the Northeast corridor, with South Florida. It's actually surpassed South Florida. The problem is there's no to think of a mega region as an economic engine like that. I mean, it's really it takes a lot of coordination between cities. I mean, it takes transportation planning. It starts with really transportation planning, but you have to create kind of a common political agenda. Like, what is it that these cities within the mega region need from the state legislature and from Congress? The problem is there's none of that really going on between Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, and San Antonio, Austin. It's still pretty much every city for itself. So really, I think what Cisneros is really trying to say in this book, I mean, he is trying to kind of create this idea that, you do have this kind of, this kind of cohesive engine, and it's going to do great things economically and makes Texas much more prosperous in the future and bring a lot of jobs. But really what he's saying is big cities are hugely important to the economy. And we need to be more mindful of that. Like we need a legislature and state political leadership that isn't trying to dump all over big cities like Governor Greg Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. I mean, it's damaging to the work of cities to try to curb annexation rights, to say, okay, big cities and big urban counties, you can't lobby the legislature for what you need. That's a waste of taxpayer dollars. And by the way, if there's a lot of voting going on in big cities and you're voting for Democrats, hey, guess what? We're going to take some of your early voting opportunities away from you. All of that is detrimental. And I think that was part of the thrust of his book. I mean, to say, look, I mean, these cities, if it weren't for the economic production of these cities, I mean, we'd be really hurting in Texas. Like these three centers are pulling the state. Like when we talk about the Texas miracle, it's happening here within the triangle. Yet, you couldn't tell looking at the state's political leadership.
Yeah, I mean, because you got a situation where, as he pointed out, more people are living now in cities, and that's where the economic activity is. But the political leadership in the state, the Republican leadership, their votes are concentrated in rural areas, and so they are sort of hostile to cities.
I mean, you have Governor Abbott constantly making hay out of all the people who are moving from California and elsewhere in the country to Texas. Well, guess where they're moving to? It's not, it's not West Texas. I mean, they're moving, almost all of them are moving to these urban centers. And yet, so he's touting that on the one hand, and he's attacking cities on the other. I mean, it's just nonsensical.
It is nonsensical. And as you pointed out, I mean, the lack of coordination between the cities. I remember a few years ago when, there was kind of we've had these periodic sort of pushes in San Antonio to try to see what we can do. Should we have a new airport? Should we work with Austin? And I think a few years back there was talk about working with Austin, but it seemed like kind of a non-starter. As you pointed out, there's never some kind of rail system connecting the cities in the Texas Triangle would have been fantastic.
Yeah, I was going to say, we can't even do commuter rail between San Antonio and Austin. Yeah. I mean, like if you can't do a rail line covering 70 miles or, like 90 if you want to go to northern Austin.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just not, that's a pretty easy one, you would think. If both cities were serious about making it happen, it would have happened by now.
I was just going to say that as you pointed out in the column, I mean, it's the triangle is kind of more of an idea than a reality at this point.
Yeah. I mean, and it's, even, with the southern tip of this triangle, I mean, there's so little communication going on between San Antonio and Austin right now. I mean, it's kind of nuts, but you can understand it from Austin's standpoint. Like Austin is, like really Houston is Texas's only real global city. I mean, it is an energy giant. It is the most diverse city in the country, and it's got some amazing, medical assets. But Austin's it's heading out. I mean, Austin is taking off, and it's so you can understand there. It's like San Antonio for Austin is kind of an afterthought at this point.
Yeah, and the thing is that there's, obviously Austin would love to have major league sports. One of the major franchise in one of the major professional sports. San Antonio would like to have more than just NBA basketball, but it would seem to me that the best course would be for there to be some cooperation and maybe try to pitch something maybe between the two cities. So it wouldn't really be like a San Antonio thing or an Austin thing, but maybe it's more of like a regional Texas thing.
Yeah, I mean, like Fort Worth and Dallas, they've got Arlington. Hey, and guess what? You've got a huge stadium in Arlington.
Right. There you go.
I mean, it's a little, it's about 30 miles between Fort Worth and Houston, or Dallas, and 70 between San Antonio and Austin. So you're talking about a little more space. But yeah, I mean, you're right. Absolutely.
Well, I think we're going to wrap things up on that note. Thank you all for listening. Hope everybody's doing well, and we'll be back with you next week. Take care.